Good morning. So I am given the task to respond to the responses to a very, very rich volume that I also really enjoyed reading, Alon. So a few comments, because I'm sort of responding extemporaneously. First of all, Alon, your interest in the question of idolatry, I'm sure, comes out of your very rich engagement with other religious traditions and how to make sense of that from a Jewish perspective. So this is not surprising. You can say it's a form of Jewish theology of religions that you have tried to develop through the years and invited other contributions in. So I'm very grateful for all the work that you have done in this area. I think it's very important. And what I see in the work that you have done is the way in which you have turned, or you and other Jewish scholars have turned a critique of other religions or other forms of faith back onto yourself. So all of the articles are no longer looking at how idolatry is something that is practiced in other religious traditions, but it's about the way in which Jews relate to their own religious tradition, about the way in which they relate to institutions, to political power, to moral principles, and so forth. So what I see in the volume is very much sort of a critique of other religions turned back upon the Jewish tradition itself, which is, I think, a very noble way, or an exemplary way for other religious traditions also to look upon themselves with the critiques that they have leveled against other religious traditions. So a few things about what I have perceived to be common threads in all of these responses to the book, and questions that arise out of those common threads. So clearly all presentations emphasize the importance of not absolutizing anything created, anything historical, anything material, even up to institutions themselves. What I see in some of the presentations, though, are particularities that each religion brings to the conversation. So this is, of course, what you were trying to elicit in these responses. How do Christians, Muslims, Hindus understand the notion of idolatry? And then I think it becomes not only a matter of comparing notes, but how have they learned actually from the book? How have other religions learned from the Jewish approach to idolatry? And then how can Jews also learn from the way other traditions understand idolatry? And so those are the kinds of thoughts or questions that I would lift up for our conversation also. What are some of the particular elements that can be instructive for deeper understanding of idolatry in any particular religious tradition? And what I got from Werner's presentation is his continuous emphasis on the aspect of love and critique of anything that stands in between the individual and their relationship to God, including attachment or idolatry of institutions. And that brings me to a question that will apply to all the presentations. So if we are forbidden to attach any ultimate value to mediators of the divine, how can we still sort of surrender to whatever particular mediations are offered in our concrete tradition? So how do we carry the particularity of our own traditions within this radical critique of idolatry as also to be applied to institutions? How do we carry our own identity in relationship to others? So that's a question that came up in particular with Werner's presentation. Jeffrey's presentation reminded me of something that I read in one of the chapters where Jeffrey points to the the duality or the ambivalence in Hinduism of, on the one hand, being unapologetic about worshipping particular gods and murtis and bringing them into the house and so on. And on the other hand, having also a radical apophaticism with regard to ultimate reality as being Nirguna Brahman and so on. And in one of the chapters in the book, it was the chapter by Arnold Eisen, he mentions a feeling of what he calls spiritual regret in observing, he says, the way images move worshippers in other religious traditions. So, is this kind of radical critique of idolatry also, or in the Jewish tradition, with regard to Hinduism, is there something in there still that Judaism can maybe learn from Hinduism in terms of the way in which images still may move the heart, and in a way in which that can happen without being attached to those images? So there's something in what Jeffrey was saying that I thought was interesting to think about further, and I guess it's also a continuation of what I was mentioning also with regard to Werner's presentation. In terms of the emphasis on the heart, also in the Muslim tradition, and especially in Ibn Arabi, that kind of notion of dynamism or flexibility that comes with the heart reminded me of one of the papers that talks about monotheism as an unfinished project, as something that all religious traditions have to move towards ultimately to find each other in a kind of transcendent unity. And so that dynamism, I think, is a very important idea for all of us to think about in terms of how every religious tradition has to realize its own monotheism moving forward. So I thought that was something that reminded me again of one of the pieces in the volume. And then coming to Adam's presentation, again, the idea that a fixed understanding of God goes together with very strong moral conviction or principles about how to behave in the world and what kind of moral actions to take. And especially your critique is a critique of the way the most vulnerable people are treated. And in your notes, you mentioned in particular the way women and gay people are treated in your church, that being based on very strong religious principles. And there again, sort of, how can we find a way of continuing to uphold moral principles in religious traditions without leading to a form of idolatry? These are, of course, very strong examples that are to be critiqued, but what is the alternative to this is sort of my question. How do we relate to our traditions and their moral principles and the way they draw us to higher spiritual values? We need some form of mediation. How do we carry our distinctive mediations without leading to idolatry, without idolizing them? So these are some of the thoughts that came up. I think there's clearly a very common thread throughout the different traditions and throughout the different papers, but there's sort of small differences here and there, I think, that can lead to an interesting discussion. And for me, the overall principle is sort of how do you relate sort of this radical critique of idolatry with religious identities? So I hope this leads to a fruitful discussion. Thank you.